A girl vanished during what should have been a routine vacation with her dad and older brother, while her mother, who stayed home, was left heartbroken and desperate for answers. Everyone assumed she'd been kidnapped, but no one truly knew what had happened. Then, a decade later, her older brother reveals the shocking truth about what really went down on that trip with their dad. The fluorescent lights in the hospital hallway flickered more intensely at this late hour. Or maybe it was just Reena Marlo's exhaustion messing with her senses. At 43, she felt at least a decade older as she signed off her charts at the nurse's station. Her colleagues waved goodnight as she gathered her things, her body running on autopilot after an 11-hour shift. "See you tomorrow, Reena," called one of the younger nurses. "Bright and early," Reena replied, though there was nothing bright about starting her morning shift at the preschool before heading back to the hospital in the afternoon. But bills didn't pay themselves, and single-handedly supporting a family of 3, well, 2 now, required sacrifices. The night air hit her face as she stepped outside, a refreshing coolness after the sterile warmth of the hospital. The bus was late, as usual, giving her mind unwanted time to wander. 10 years. 10 years since her daughter, Laya, disappeared on that family vacation in Egypt. 10 years of searching, pleading, praying. 10 years of watching her husband deteriorate into a shell of himself, drowning his guilt in alcohol. 10 years of seeing her son, Tommy, grow up under the shadow of his sister's absence. When the bus finally arrived, Reena took a seat by the window, resting her forehead against the cool glass as suburban houses blurred past. By the time she reached her stop, it was nearly 11 p.m. The darkened windows of her home told their own story. No one had waited up for her. The front door creaked as she entered, the silence of the house enveloping her instantly. She moved quietly through the darkened living room, her nurse's training making her steps light and deliberate. Pausing at Tommy's door, she gently pushed it open, the dim light from the hallway casting a thin stripe across his sleeping form. At 20, he still slept curled slightly on his side, just as he had as a child. She resisted the urge to brush the dark hair from his forehead, not wanting to disturb him. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Reena set her nursing bag on the dressing table, methodically unpacking her stethoscope, pens, and ID badge. The empty bed didn't surprise her. Rick was out again, no doubt at one of the local bars. She sighed deeply, the weight of her exhaustion settling into her bones. After a quick shower that did little to ease her muscle tension, Reena changed into an old t-shirt and comfy pants. She checked her phone, typing a quick message to Rick. "Where are you? It's late." She knew there'd likely be no reply, but the ritual of checking in had become a habit she couldn't break. Settling at the small desk in the corner of the bedroom, Reena opened her laptop. The screen lit up her tired face as she logged into her email, checking for any new messages from the various missing persons forums and groups she'd joined over the years. Most were spam or well-meaning but useless tips that led nowhere. Still, she scrolled through them carefully, as she did every night. As she conducted her nightly research, guilt gnawed at her core, a familiar, constant companion. If only she hadn't been working that day. If only she'd joined them on that vacation from the start. Her second job as a preschool teacher had been new back then, taken on when Rick's military disability benefits were cut. They needed the extra income, and she thought the vacation would be good for Rick, a chance for him to bond with the kids away from his growing depression. "It'll be therapeutic," his therapist had suggested, and Reena had agreed. "A chance to reset," their family friend Elena had echoed. Reena was supposed to join them later that week, but an emergency at the hospital kept her back. The irony wasn't lost on her. While she'd been saving strangers' lives in the ER, her own daughter had vanished without a trace. Reena rubbed her throbbing temples, closing her eyes against the glare of the screen. The burden she carried seemed to grow heavier. Each day, not lighter, as people promised grief would. She worked endlessly to provide some stability for what remained of her family. Though Tommy had started working at the local supermarket, she insisted he save his earnings for his future. She wouldn't let her son's prospects dim because of their circumstances. The sound of the front door opening downstairs pulled her from her thoughts. Heavy footsteps made their uneven way up the stairs, and moments later, Rick appeared in the doorway. His once handsome face was bloated from years of drinking, his military-trained physique long since softened. The smell of stale beer and cigarettes clung to him. "Still at it," he slurred, gesturing toward the laptop. "Don't you ever give up?" Reena closed the screen part way, already bracing for the argument sure to follow. "You're drunk. Again. So what if I am?" Rick leaned against the doorframe, his balance shaky. "You left Tommy alone," she said, her voice tight with contained anger. Rick scoffed. "He's 20, for Christ's sake, not a kid. He can handle being home alone. Probably even likes the freedom." "No one likes being alone, Rick." Reena stood, her fatigue momentarily forgotten in the face of her rising frustration. "You're not working. The least you could do while I spend all my energy earning money for this family is spend some quality time with your son instead of wasting my hard-earned cash on booze." "Here we go again." Rick rolled his eyes. The martyr speech. "If you'd saved all the money you spent on beer over the years, I could probably afford to go to Egypt and search for Laya myself." Rick's expression darkened. "It's been 10 years, Reena. 10 years. You won't find her, even if you went there." "You're too drunk for this conversation," Reena said, turning away from him. "You were probably drunk that evening. Too, weren't you? When Laya disappeared. It was your fault. You were there with her, and you didn't keep an eye on her." Rick's face twisted with anger. "Don't you dare blame me. That girl just left the hotel and never came back. We were together, spending the whole day at the beach, but she had to wander off by herself in the evening. Tommy was there in the hotel, too, so I can't be the only one responsible." "Tommy was only 10. Reena's voice rose. "You can't expect a child to keep an eye on his 8-year-old sister all the time." The argument escalated quickly, both hurling accusations, fueled by a decade of unresolved grief and resentment. Reena felt her control slipping, the careful facade she maintained crumbling under the weight of her exhaustion and Rick's belligerence. "I'm done with this," she finally said, moving toward the door. "I'm sleeping downstairs tonight." But as she tried to pass him, Rick grabbed her arm, his grip painfully tight. "Don't you walk away from me," he growled, his eyes narrowed. "You'll show me some respect." "Let go of me," Reena said, her voice low and dangerous. "You don't deserve any respect for being a drunk." "I'm an ex-military man," Rick shouted, shoving her back against the wall with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. He raised his hand, and Reena flinched, bracing for the blow. But it never came. A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. Tommy stood in the doorway of his room downstairs, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light, witnessing the entire confrontation. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken tension. Then Rick released her, storming into the bedroom and slamming the door behind him. The distinct click of the lock followed. Reena leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to steady her breathing before descending the stairs to her son. When she reached him, she wrapped her arms around him, her maternal instinct overriding her own distress. "I'm so sorry you had to see that," she whispered. Tommy's face was grim, his jaw tight. "You can sleep in my room tonight," he said. "It's big enough and I don't mind. I can sleep on the couch." "No, sweetheart. You sleep in your room. I'll stay here in the living room." She attempted a reassuring smile. "I don't think I could sleep right now anyway." Tommy frowned. "I'm scared he might come after you again if he sees you sleeping on the couch." Reena looked at her son, no longer a boy but a young man with eyes too old for his years, and nodded. "Okay, thank you." "Did he hit you?" Tommy asked quietly, his eyes searching her face. "No," Reena assured him, touching his cheek, gently. "Everything's fine. How was your therapy session today? Tommy shrugged, clearly unwilling to elaborate. Fine. Same as always. Reena followed him into his bedroom, suddenly aware of how bone-tired she felt. You're right. I should sleep. I've got the morning shift at the preschool tomorrow and then the hospital in the afternoon. They said goodnight, and Tommy left to settle on the living room couch. Reena closed the bedroom door and sank onto her son's bed, the familiar scent of his laundry detergent surrounding her. As she lay in the darkness, her thoughts drifted to how drastically their lives had changed. Rick had been injured during his military deployment, a severe shrapnel wound to his right leg from an IED explosion that caused partial loss of mobility and chronic nerve pain. He'd undergone multiple surgeries, including a metal rod implant, which drained their savings and strained their finances severely. On top of the physical injuries, he'd been diagnosed with PTSD, which he constantly used as an excuse for why he could no longer work. Over the years, his condition worsened. Staying home with no purpose or structure only deepened his depression and reliance on alcohol. Reena's tears dampened the pillow as she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her circumstances. A missing daughter, a broken husband, a son bearing scars she couldn't see, and the exhaustion of holding it all together with increasingly frayed strength. Reena jolted awake to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment she was disoriented, then recognized Tommy's bedroom. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and felt her heart drop as she saw the time. 10 a.m. She'd completely missed her morning shift at the preschool. No, she muttered, sitting up too quickly and feeling a rush of dizziness. She checked her notifications and saw 3 missed calls and a message from the school principal asking why she hadn't shown up or called in. Panic seized her as she jumped out of bed. The preschool class ran from 8:01 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., which meant she'd completely missed it. She quickly typed a reply to the principal, promising to come to the school to explain in person. Reena hurried out of Tommy's room and scanned the empty house. The couch where Tommy had slept was vacant, the blanket neatly folded. He must have left for his supermarket job already. She checked the master bedroom upstairs, finding it similarly deserted. There was no sign of Rick, though the lingering smell of stale alcohol remained. She changed into fresh clothes, skipping a shower to save time, and hurried to catch the bus to the school. Her mind raced with worry about her job security. She couldn't afford to lose any income, especially with Rick contributing nothing. As the bus approached the school, Reena spotted the principal, Mr. Daniels, locking the school gate. She rushed toward him, her heart pounding. "Mr. Daniels, I'm so sorry about this morning," she called out. The principal turned, his expression a mix of concern and professional composure. "Reena, I was worried when you didn't show up. It's not like you to miss work without notice. I know, and I'm truly sorry." Reena tried to catch her breath. "There was a situation at home last night and I somehow slept through my alarm." Mr. Daniels studied her face. "You know, Reena, I've been meaning to talk to you about your schedule. Working 8 hours every evening at the hospital, plus this morning job. And I know you pick up weekend shifts at that restaurant too. It's just too much. I was wondering when something like this would happen." Reena felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with the fear of losing her position. "I know it seems like a lot, but I can manage it. Today was just Mr. Daniels held up a hand. "Tell you what, I won't count it against you this time. Consider it a day off, but I want you to think about managing your schedule better. The kids need a teacher who's alert and present." Relief washed over her. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels. I promise this won't happen again." As the principal got into his car and drove away, Reena checked the time. She had several hours before her 2 p.m. shift at the hospital, an unexpected pocket of free time in her normally packed schedule. A sudden idea hit her. She could surprise Tommy with lunch at his workplace. It had been ages since they'd shared a meal without Rick's brooding presence. She headed toward the market area to pick up ingredients for a simple lunchbox, taking a moment to text Tommy about her plan. As she walked, Reena decided to cut through a series of alleyways to shorten her route to the market. The narrow passages were nearly empty in the late morning, the buildings on either side casting cool shadows. She was about halfway through when movement ahead caught her attention. From a distance, she saw a young man in bright yellow shoes and a black hoodie talking with a blonde woman wearing skimpy clothing despite the daytime hour. Two men in black sunglasses and leather jackets stood nearby, their stances suggesting they were part of the conversation. Reena slowed her pace, something about the young man's posture striking her as familiar, though his back was to her. She couldn't see his face, but something about those yellow shoes tugged at her memory. The exchange looked like some kind of transaction. Money or small packages changing hands, she couldn't be sure from this distance. Suddenly, one of the men in leather jackets noticed her watching. He nudged his companion, and both turned to stare at her. "What are you looking at, lady?" one shouted, his tone unmistakably threatening. Reena immediately turned around, her heart racing as she quickened her steps back toward the main street. Her instinct was to call the police. But what would she say? She hadn't gotten a clear view of what they were doing, and nobody seemed in immediate danger. After everything with Rick the night before, she didn't think she had the emotional energy to deal with this potential threat to herself and Tommy. As she emerged onto the busy main street, Reena tried to calm her nerves. Those yellow shoes kept nagging at her mind. Where had she seen them before? She couldn't place it, but the feeling of familiarity was unmistakable. Her appetite for shopping now gone, Reena pulled out her phone and texted Tommy directly. "Would you like to have lunch together today? I have some free time before my shift." She waited for a reply, but none came immediately. Sighing, Reena decided to head home. Maybe she could use this unexpected time to catch up on chores or rest before her hospital shift. The house was quiet when she returned. Heading upstairs to the master bedroom, Reena opened the windows to air out the lingering smell of alcohol. The room needed a thorough cleaning, and she decided to start by changing the bedding. The king-sized bed had been a wedding gift from a wealthy friend 15 years ago, an extravagant piece of furniture that seemed almost out of place in their modest home. Reena stripped off the sheets and comforter, then tried to move the heavy mattress to better reach the fitted sheet. As she pushed against it, straining with the effort, she placed one leg on the box spring for leverage. That's when she noticed something odd. A section in the middle of the box spring looked different from the rest of the fabric. Looking closer, she saw what appeared to be a seam where the material had been cut and sewn back together. "What in the world?" she murmured, running her fingers along the uneven stitching. Curiosity overcoming her, Reena grabbed a small pair of scissors from her sewing kit. She knew she might be ruining an expensive piece of furniture, but something compelled her to investigate. Carefully, she cut along the line of stitches, pulling back the fabric to reveal the cotton stuffing inside. As she dug through the fluffy material, her fingers brushed against something smooth and flat. Pulling back more cotton, she discovered several photographs hidden within the box spring. With trembling hands, she extracted them one by one. The photos were from the family vacation in Egypt 10 years ago, the trip from which Laya never returned. One photograph in particular caught her attention. Rick crouched on one knee on a sandy beach, Tommy on his right, and Laya on his left, both kids smiling. Reena turned the photo over and felt her breath catch. Written on the back was a set of coordinates. She quickly looked through the other photos, which showed various tourist sites around Egypt. On the back of a photo taken in the desert was what looked like a phone number, not a US format, likely an Egyptian one. Her heart pounding, Reena took pictures of the damaged box spring with her phone, documenting the hiding place. Then she hastily changed the bed cover and pushed the heavy bed back into position. She didn't bother to sew the box spring back together, deciding she'd deal with it later. Taking the photographs to the desk, Reena's mind raced with questions. Why had Rick hidden these photos? What significance did these coordinates and phone number hold? She picked up her phone and called Detective Mercer, who'd handled Laya's case, but the call went straight to voicemail. She checked her messages and saw Tommy had finally replied, saying he'd wait for her at the supermarket in an hour during his lunch break. Reena quickly texted back, "Something's come up. I found a clue, but I'll see you there and tell you about it later." Turning to her laptop, Reena typed the coordinates from the back of the beach photo into a search engine. The result showed a location in the center of Gifton Island off the coast of Hurghada, Egypt. She compared the sandy beach in the photo to images of Gifton Island beaches online. They matched perfectly. Why would he mark this specific location? She whispered to herself. Was this just to remember where the photo was taken? Or is this where Laya is? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She looked at the phone number on the other photo, debating whether to call it. Curiosity won out, and with shaking fingers, she dialed the international number. The line rang 3 times before a man answered, his voice in heavily accented English. "Yes, who is this?" Panic seized Reena, and she immediately ended the call, nearly dropping her phone. She searched the number online but found no relevant information. "What are you hiding, Rick?" she muttered, staring at the photos spread before her. With Detective Mercer not answering, Reena decided she needed to take these potential pieces of evidence to the police station herself. She carefully gathered the photographs, placed them in her purse, and headed downstairs, her mind spinning with possibilities. As she reached for the front door, Reena paused, checking the time. She should still have time to show these to the police and then meet Tommy for lunch before her hospital shift. She walked briskly toward the police station, the weight of the photographs in her purse feeling heavier than their physical presence warranted. Her mind churned with questions and half-formed theories, each more disturbing than the last. About 15 minutes into her journey, she passed the Rusty Anchor, a bar she knew Rick frequented. As if conjured by her thoughts, the door swung open, and Rick emerged, his face twisted in agitation. He stopped short when he saw her, genuine surprise in his bloodshot eyes. "Reena, what are you doing here?" he asked, glancing around suspiciously. "Thought you'd be home getting ready for work." Reena's mouth went dry. She hadn't prepared for this confrontation. Not here. Not now. Her hand tightened on her purse, acutely aware of its incriminating contents. I'm going to visit Tommy," she lied, avoiding his gaze. "We're planning to have lunch together." Rick narrowed his eyes, studying her face. "Oh, yeah? You sure about that?" There was something unsettling in his tone, a dangerous undercurrent that made the hair on the back of Reena's neck stand up. "Yes," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't get a chance to talk to Tommy this morning. I overslept, so I thought I'd surprise him." Rick nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I was just heading home," he said, stepping closer. "Why don't we have lunch together instead? Just the 2 of us. We can order takeout and eat at home before your shift." "I can't," Reena said, taking a cautious step back. "Not after what happened last night. I promised Tommy. He's waiting for me." Before she could finish, Rick's hand shot out, gripping her arm with painful intensity. "Tommy will understand," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Come with me, Reena." There was no request in his words, only a command. Reena felt a flutter of panic as Rick began guiding her back toward their house, his grip unyielding. She considered calling out to passers-by, but what would she say? That her husband wanted her to come home? It'd sound ridiculous, and the last thing she needed was public drama that might lead to questions about the photographs. As if reading her thoughts, Rick leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "Don't make this difficult. Not here." They walked in tense silence, Rick's hand never leaving her arm. As they reached their house, Rick unlocked the door and practically pushed her inside before securing the deadbolt. "Rick, what is this about?" Reena demanded, rubbing her arm where his fingers had dug in. "Why'd you lock the door? I need to go meet Tommy." Instead of answering, Rick advanced toward her with deliberate steps. In one fluid motion, he yanked her purse from her shoulder and emptied its contents onto the floor. Items scattered. Across the hardwood, her wallet, keys, phone, and the damning photographs from the box spring. Time seemed to slow as Rick bent down to retrieve the photos. His movements almost casual, he straightened, flipping through them with an eerie calm, before breaking into a hollow laugh. A hollow laugh escaped him, echoing unnaturally in the silent house. "Man's right. Seems like you found this," he said, his voice unnervingly soft. "What about those photos?" Reena asked, backing away from him. "I found them in the box spring," Rick finished for her, his eyes never leaving. "The photographs." "I know. I put them there." Reena continued, backing away until she hit the wall. "How do you know? And what's that coordinate? What's the phone number on the back?" Rick's smile sent a chill through her. "I think you've already figured it out, haven't you? Gifton Island. You always were thorough with your research." He held up the photos. "Someone I trusted on that island contacted me just now. Said a U.S. number called him. When he sent me the number, it was yours, Reena." His eyes flickered to her phone on the floor. "That's how I know you found the photos. And I'm guessing you were on your way to the police station, not to see Tommy. If you were going to Tommy, you would have taken the bus." Reena's heart hammered against her ribs as Rick closed the distance between them. "What about that coordinate?" she pressed, desperate to keep him talking. "Why hide the photos? What happened to Laya?" Instead of answering, Rick's hand shot out, wrapping around her throat. Reena's eyes widened in shock as his fingers tightened, cutting off her air supply. She clawed at his hand, gasping for breath. "Please," she choked out. "I'm your wife. We still have a son." Rick's expression remained cold, unmoved by her pleas. Reena's eyesight began to blur at the edges as her lungs screamed for oxygen. Suddenly, her phone on the floor began to ring, its cheerful tone jarringly bright in the grim moment. Reena struggled to speak, her words barely audible. "It must be Tommy. I promised lunch." The persistent ringtone seemed to agitate Rick. His eyes darted to the phone, his grip on Reena's throat loosening momentarily. Then, without warning, his face contorted, and he released her entirely, stumbling backward with his hands pressed against his ears. Reena collapsed to her, knees coughing and gulping air. She crawled toward her phone, but Rick recovered quickly. He lunged forward, snatching it just as she reached for it and jabbed the end call button, silencing the ringtone. "No police," he growled, his breathing ragged. "No Tommy. No one." Before Reena could react, Rick grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the garage. From a drawer, he pulled a zip tie and bound her wrists, then used a shop rag to gag her. With surprising strength, he shoved her into the back seat of their old car, the one they rarely used to save on gas. "I won't let you give that photo to the police," he muttered as he slammed the door. Rick climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, his movements jerky and erratic. As the garage door opened and the car reversed onto the street, Reena's mind raced with the horrifying realization that her husband, the father of her children, was capable of far worse than she'd ever imagined. The drive was a disorienting blur for Reena. With her hands bound and mouth gagged, she could only watch through the window as familiar neighborhoods gave way to parts of town she rarely visited. Eventually, Rick turned down a side street and parked behind a shabby-looking building with a neon sign reading, "The Last Call." The name sent a chill through Reena that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't one of Rick's usual haunts. She'd made it her business to know those places, had even visited some to bring him home on particularly bad nights. This place was unknown territory, which could only mean he'd deliberately kept it separate from his regular life. Rick cut the engine, the sudden silence pressing against Reena's ears. He turned in his seat, studying her with detached interest, as if she were a problem to solve rather than his wife of 20 years. "We're going inside," he said finally, his voice emotionless. "If you try to signal anyone or make any noise, I'll tell them you're having a psychotic episode. Who do you think they'll believe? A decorated veteran or the overworked wife who's been obsessing over a decade-old disappearance?" The casual cruelty of the question stole what little fight remained in Reena. She'd spent years defending him to doctors, friends, and Tommy, insisting that beneath the PTSD and alcoholism was the good man she'd married. Now she wondered if that man had ever existed at all. Rick exited the driver's side and circled to the rear door. When he opened it, daylight spilled across Reena's face, temporarily blinding her after the dimness of the car. He grasped her arm, fingers digging into the same bruises who'd created earlier, and pulled her from the vehicle. "Don't make a scene," he warned, his breath hot against her ear. The smell of whiskey and something medicinal, maybe the pills he claimed he never took, made her stomach turn. Rick guided her through a back entrance, his grip painful on her bound arms. The interior was dimly lit, with the stale smell of cigarettes and cheap liquor hanging in the air. Despite the early hour, several men sat at a worn bar, while others lounged in booths along the wall. They barely looked up as Rick entered with his bound wife, suggesting this wasn't the first unusual sight they'd witnessed here. A tall man with a shaved head and multiple tattoos across his neck approached them. He wore an expensive watch that seemed out of place in the dingy surroundings. "Rick," he acknowledged with a nod, his eyes assessing Reena coldly. "This is her." "I've had enough of this woman," Rick declared, pushing Reena forward slightly. "Deal with her quick, and no mess." Reena's eyes widened as understanding crashed over her. This wasn't just about stopping her from going to the police. Rick intended for her to disappear permanently. She tried to scream through the gag, the sound coming out as a muffled whimper that drew no attention from the other patrons. The tattooed man took hold of her arm, his grip surprisingly gentle compared to Rick's bruising force. His fingertips were calloused, his palms warm and dry against her clammy skin. "Take her to the back," called a heavy-set man from behind the bar, his focus never leaving the glass he was polishing with a grimy rag. As the tattooed man guided her away, Reena twisted her head back, desperate for one last look at Rick. She saw another man approach him, leaning in close to ask, "You want the usual girl?" Rick's response floated clearly across the room, his voice lighter now that the burden of her presence was being lifted. "Yeah, with something to take my mind off all this." He reached into his jacket, producing a thick envelope that he handed to the bartender with practiced ease. The man peered inside, whistling low at the contents before tucking it beneath. "The counter. What a good use of your wife's money," the man laughed. "You sure you want to get rid of her? You're losing your ATM." "Don't ask, just do it," Rick snapped, already turning toward a doorway on the opposite side of the room where a young blonde woman in a tight dress waited, her expression vacant. The tattooed man guided Reena down a narrow hallway to a small, windowless room containing only a metal chair and a cabinet. He pushed her into the chair and secured her legs with more zip ties, working quickly and efficiently. Despite her terror, Reena studied his face carefully, determined that if she somehow survived, she'd be able to identify him to the police. As he straightened to his full height, recognition struck her like lightning. This was one of the men, in leather jackets she'd seen earlier that day in the alley during her shortcut to the market. But who was the man in the bright yellow shoes? Certainly not Rick. Once she was securely bound to the chair, the man straightened and looked directly into her eyes for the first time. What she saw there confused her, not the cold detachment of a hired killer, but something softer, almost apologetic. His expression shifted, the hardness melting as he pressed a finger to his lips in a universal gesture for silence. From his pocket, he pulled a smartphone, its screen cracked at one corner, but the display still bright in the dim room. After tapping the screen several times, he turned it to show her. On the display was a banking app showing a transaction record with An amount that made Reena's eyes widen in shock. Easily 5 figures, more money than she could save in a year of double shifts. But it was the name on the transaction that truly stole her breath. Tommy Marlo, her son. He'd paid this man. The pieces started falling into place, forming a picture she didn't want to believe. The bright yellow shoes, of course they were. Tommy's. That's why they'd felt so familiar. As the realization settled over her like a leaden blanket, Reena felt tears welling, not for herself, but for her son. What had Rick done to drive Tommy to such desperate measures? And what would become of her boy if this plan succeeded? The tattooed man switched off his phone, sliding it back into his pocket. He moved to the cabinet against the wall. His movements, deliberate as he pulled a key from around his neck and unlocked the metal doors. Inside, mounted on hooks and organized with military precision, was an arsenal that made Reena's blood run cold. Handguns of various calibers, boxes of ammunition stacked neatly, and what looked like a disassembled rifle on the bottom shelf. The man selected a revolver, its blue-black finish absorbing what little light reached it. With practiced movements, he opened the cylinder, showing Reena it contained a single bullet. He spun the cylinder, the metallic clicks echoing in the small room like a macabre countdown. 1 bullet, he said quietly. For your husband, from Tommy. Reena shook her head frantically, making muffled protests behind her gag. Her eyes pleaded with the man, trying to convey what her voice couldn't. Don't do this. Not in my son's name. Before the man could respond, the door opened. Tommy stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. He wore jeans and a hoodie, and on his feet were the bright yellow shoes Reena had glimpsed in the alley earlier. Mom, he breathed, his voice cracking on the single syllable. He rushed to her side, dropping to his knees beside the chair. His fingers, trembling slightly, worked at the knot of the gag. The cloth fell away, and Reena gasped as fresh air touched her dry mouth. I'm so sorry they had to restrain you like this, Tommy said, not meeting her eyes as he began working on the zip ties binding her wrists. It's just to make sure you wouldn't fight back and ruin the plan. I didn't want that, but Jerome insisted it was necessary. The tattooed man, apparently Jerome, gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. I'm also sorry for what I'm about to do, Tommy continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. But I can't let him hurt you again. If he brought you here, that means only one thing. He wanted to get rid of you permanently. As blood rushed painfully back into her freed hands, Reena grabbed Tommy's arm. No, she said hoarsely. Tommy, listen to me. If the police find out about this, they'll put you in prison. You can't do this. Tommy's face hardened. I don't care. After everything Dad did, I just want him gone. What do you mean? Reena searched her son's face. Tommy, what are you talking about? The truth is too painful, Mom, Tommy whispered, his eyes haunted. Jerome, who'd been standing silently, his presence almost forgotten in the intensity of the moment between mother and son, stepped forward. Your dad's upstairs with that woman, he said, his voice low and urgent. Now's the right time if we're going to do this. Tommy nodded, rising to his feet with the fluid grace of youth. He reached for the gun in Jerome's hand, his expression set with terrible determination. In that moment, time seemed to slow for Reena. She saw her son, her beautiful, sensitive boy, who'd once refused to step on ants and cried when his sister's tooth fell out, reaching for a weapon with the intent to kill. In his face, she saw not just hatred for his father, but a lifetime of pain she'd somehow failed to protect him from. The realization galvanized her. Moving faster than either man expected, Reena lunged toward Tommy, her muscles protesting after their confinement. Her fingers closed around his phone, which protruded slightly from his hoodie pocket. Mom, what? Tommy began, but Reena had already pressed the SOS button, the one they'd configured years ago after Laya's disappearance, a feature that automatically dialed 911 and sent the phone's location to emergency services. No, Tommy shouted, trying to grab the phone back. The device began its connection sequence, a female voice announcing, "Emergency services have been contacted. Please stay on the line." The tattooed man cursed loudly. "Deal's off," he declared, quickly unloading the gun and shoving it back into the cabinet. "I don't do murder with cops on the way." He gestured to someone outside the door, and within seconds, he and his men were rushing out of the building. Tommy stared at Reena, his expression a mix of anger and devastation. "Why did you do that?" He was going to pay. "I wanted to end this." Reena held her son's face between her hands. "I can't let you become a criminal, Tommy. I've already lost one child. I can't lose you too." Tommy's eyes welled with tears, his tough facade crumbling to reveal the wounded boy beneath. "But as long as he's alive, we'll never be safe. You'll never be safe. I saw what he did to you last night. I've seen what he's capable of for years." "Listen to me," Reena said urgently, hearing sirens in the distance. "This stays between us. We tell the police we caught your father here using drugs. I'll show them the evidence I found, and you'll tell them everything. That happened in Egypt, but you never paid anyone to harm your father. Do you understand me?" Tommy hesitated, conflict evident in his eyes. But what if he tells them? What if those men talk? "They won't," Reena said with more confidence than she felt. "They're long gone. And Jerome doesn't seem the type to confess to conspiracy charges." She squeezed his hands. "And who'd believe Rick over us? He's been threatening and abusing us for years." Tommy nodded slowly, looking suddenly young and vulnerable. "Okay," he whispered. "Good. Now, help me clean this place. We need to wipe down everything you and I touched." Together, they quickly ran their sleeves over the chair, doorknob, and cabinet handles, anywhere fingerprints might have been, left. As the sirens grew louder, Reena studied her son's profile, seeing both the child he'd been and the man he was becoming. Despite everything, she felt a surge of fierce pride, not for the plan he'd conceived, but for the love that had driven it. Tommy had been willing to sacrifice his freedom, his future, maybe even his soul, to protect her. Police cars screeched to a halt outside the building, their lights casting red and blue shadows through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. "Remember," Reena whispered, "you were trying to save me. Nothing more." Reena and Tommy stepped out of the bar just as police cars pulled up, their lights flashing against the building's grimy exterior. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, approaching cautiously. "My husband is inside," Reena called out, raising her hands to show she wasn't a threat. "Upstairs. He brought me here against my will." The officers approached, one holstering his weapon to speak with them while the others entered the building. "Ma'am, we received an emergency call from this location. Can you tell me what happened?" Reena nodded, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil. "My name is Laya Marlo. My husband, Rick Marlo, abducted me from our home and brought me here. I believe he intended to have me killed." As she spoke, more officers emerged from the building, escorting Rick and a scantily clad woman. Rick's face contorted with rage when he saw Reena and Tommy standing with the police. "This is a setup!" he shouted, struggling against the officer's grip. "They're lying! Whatever they told you is a lie!" The officer interviewing. Reena ignored Rick's outburst. "We'll need both of you to come to the station to give formal statements," he said. Reena reached into her pocket, producing the photographs she'd managed to grab before being forced from the house. "Officer, I found these hidden in our home today. They're from our family vacation in Egypt 10 years ago, the trip where my daughter disappeared." The officer examined the photos, noting the coordinates and phone number on the backs. "We'll take these as evidence," he said, placing them in an evidence bag. Tommy stepped forward. "I was there," he said, his voice unexpectedly firm. "I was 10 years old when my father murdered my sister. He's been threatening and abusing me ever since to keep me quiet. Without warning, Tommy lifted his shirt, revealing a pattern of old scars across his back, evidence of systematic abuse that made Reena gasp in horror. She'd never seen these marks before. Tommy had always been careful to change privately, even at home. "Oh, Tommy," she whispered, reaching for him. As Rick was being placed in a police car, he locked eyes with Tommy. "You think you're smarter than me?" he called out. "No. I'll make sure you end up behind bars, too." His gaze shifted to Reena. "This is a war zone now, and I'll defeat all my enemies." He spat toward them before being forced into the car, his final act of defiance making Reena flinch. She watched as the man she'd married, the father of her children, transformed before her eyes into someone unrecognizable, a monster who'd been hiding in plain sight for years. At the police station, Rick and the woman were processed through, booking while Reena and Tommy were taken to separate interview rooms. Detective Mercer, who'd worked Laya's case from the beginning, joined Reena with a folder of notes. "Mrs. Marlo," he said, his expression grave, "I apologize for missing your call earlier. Tell me everything that happened today." Reena recounted finding the photographs, the coordinates to Gifton Island, and the phone number she believed belonged to someone Rick had paid to cover up Laya's death. She described Rick's violent reaction when he discovered she'd found the photos, his abduction of her, and bringing her to the bar. "I believe he killed her, based on what he implied, and Tommy's statement," she concluded, her voice breaking. "I think Laya is buried somewhere on that island, and Rick paid someone to protect that secret." Detective Mercer nodded solemnly. "We'll coordinate with Egyptian authorities immediately. That phone number may lead us to whoever helped your husband." He paused, studying her face. "What I need to understand is how you ended up at that bar. And if your husband had paid those men to kill you, why hadn't they done so before we arrived? And how did your son know where to find you?" Reena carefully explained her version of events, leaving out Tommy's involvement with the men. "Tommy and I were supposed to have lunch together. He called me during my struggle with Rick, but the call ended abruptly. He must have suspected I was in danger. We have a family tracker app on our phones that we installed years ago when Laya disappeared. We rarely use it now, but it was still active." Detective Mercer frowned, making notes. "Something still doesn't add up, Mrs. Marlo. I need you to tell me the whole truth." Before Reena could respond, there was a knock at the door. Another detective entered, his expression serious. "Tommy Marlo has confessed everything," he announced. "He claims he knew his father had paid those men for prostitutes, and potentially to kill his mother if she discovered the truth about what happened 10 years ago." The detective continued, "According to your son, he paid those men a higher price than his father, without Rick's knowledge. He asked them to kill Rick while he was with the woman because he didn't want him to hurt you anymore. He said he'd already lost his sister and couldn't bear to lose his mother, too." Reena's hands flew to her mouth. "No. He also said you stopped him because you didn't want him to become a murderer. The men apparently got away before we arrived." Tears streamed down Reena's face as she realized Tommy had chosen to tell the complete truth, not protecting himself as she'd instructed. "Tommy also told us what happened 10 years ago," the detective added. "According to him, your husband had been abusing both children for years. The abuse continued until today. Rick never took the medications prescribed for his PTSD and was drinking heavily, which you partially knew about. But you were working most of the time and weren't home much. You trusted him and never suspected the extent of the abuse." Reena nodded, wiping away tears. "I should have known. I should have seen the signs. Your son claims that on the day Laya disappeared, Rick had been drinking at a hotel bar. He returned to their room, took Laya with him, and when he came back later that night, Laya was gone. He threatened Tommy, saying if he ever told anyone, he'd hurt both Tommy and you." Detective Mercer reached across the table, his voice gentle. "We'll coordinate with Egyptian authorities to find the man Rick paid. That person is likely the key to finding out what happened to Laya." "Whatever happened to her," Reena whispered. "I just hope her soul is at peace now and that Rick will receive the punishment he deserves." She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. What about my son? What'll happen to him? He'll be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, Detective Mercer said frankly. But given the circumstances, the court might show leniency. The fact that he stopped short of actually committing the crime will work in his favor. Reena straightened, finding a new reserve of strength. I've lived a bitter life for the past decade, she said. But I'll plead with the judge for my son. He didn't go through with killing his father. He chose to be better, despite everything he's endured. Detective Mercer nodded. That's fair. I hope justice will be served for all of you. He stood. For now, we'll continue the investigation. Please wait outside while we process everything. Reena walked into the corridor, emotionally drained. Through a doorway, she saw Tommy being processed by an officer, his hands cuffed in front of him. Their eyes met across the room, hers filled with sorrow, his with a strange sort of peace, as if a terrible burden had finally been lifted. When the booking process was complete, an officer allowed Reena a brief moment with her son before they took him to a holding cell. I'm so sorry, Mum, Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Reena touched his face gently. Thank you for saving my life, she said. If you hadn't intervened, we'd all just be counting days until we ended up in the graves Rick had prepared for us. I couldn't let him hurt you anymore, Tommy said simply. Listen to me, Reena said firmly. You didn't kill your father. You're not a murderer. And whatever he or anyone else says against you in court, I will believe you and testify for you. We're going to get through this, Tommy, together. As the officer led Tommy away, Reena watched her son's straight back and raised head. Despite everything they'd endured, Laya's disappearance, Rick's abuse, and the crushing weight of secrets, they'd survived. The truth, painful as it was, had finally come to light. For the first time in 10 years, Reena felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate hope of finding Laya alive, but the quiet, steady hope that justice would prevail, that evil would be punished, and that she and Tommy might eventually find peace. Whatever lay ahead, trials, investigations, painful revelations, they'd face it together. The long night of secrecy and suffering was finally giving way to the first pale light of truth.